back with you today. And we have quite a bit of news. If you haven't heard, let me just tell you that our special guest, who I will introduce in a moment, we're delighted to have him with us, is going to discuss the impact of a new law which the governor signed into effect yesterday, Senate Bill 90, which is the voter suppression bill. Now, many of you know that the League believes the sweeping legislation will undoubtedly make it harder for voters to vote. It's going to impact especially elderly voters, disabled voters, students, and communities of color, and all voters really, because of the restrictive provisions. Yesterday, as soon as the governor signed, the League of Women Voters of Florida, along with the Black Voters Fund and the Florida Alliance for Retired Americans, along with several individual plaintiffs, filed a lawsuit that will be heard in federal court, a lawsuit against the state of Florida for this law. We believe this law is unconstitutional for a variety of reasons. So with that summary, let me just go ahead and introduce our speaker, who is going to talk quite a bit about this law and how it affects Florida's voters and third-party registration organizations like ours, as well as the Supervisors of Elections. Ion V. Sancho served 28 years as the Supervisor of Election for Leon County and recognized for his expertise in voter education and voting technologies. He's testified before both chambers of commerce and before other federal and state panels. An innovator, Supervisor Sancho introduced early voting to Florida in 1994, as well as pioneering Florida's first integrated Windows voter registration database. Supervisor Sancho was appointed the technical advisor to the 2000 Florida recount by the Florida Supreme Court. And with that, Supervisor Sancho, we're absolutely delighted to have you today. Welcome, the floor is all yours. You'll just need to unmute your microphone. There you go.
I'm unmuted now. It's a hard thing to mute me, but technology is pretty wild. Thank you very much for inviting me to address the League of Women Voters on this important issue. Let me begin by saying this 48-page bill is entirely unnecessary, in my opinion. Outside of three small technical areas, which I think are positive enhancements to the state of Florida's vote processing system, the overwhelming majority of this 48-page bill is completely unnecessary. And in my opinion, designed to intimidate organizations like the League of Women Voters, third-party organizations, and to intimidate the Supervisor of Elections, trying to control their behavior. And so without further ado, I'll start going through some of these processes and identify the problem areas which I think emerge. Right off the bat, what the bill does is attempt to limit the Supervisor of Elections' ability to enter into consent decrees if they're sued in federal court over potential problems that are in their jurisdiction. The law creates a very, very cumbersome process, which if you are in a suit and the upshot is that there's going to be a consent decree, which is not an unusual process. Right after the 2000 election, for example, I entered into a consent decree with the other 66 Supervisor of Elections and the Secretary of State's office relative to not purging voters because of the problems with illegally listed individuals as felons that really destroyed the validity of the 2000 election. False information was a real problem, as well as election officials' errors in that election. And that was because there was no direction provided by the Secretary of State to the Supervisor of Elections over the conducting of the 2000 recount. A real dereliction of the Secretary of State's duty, whose one of their chief responsibilities under the statute is to ensure that we're all operating fairly under the same standards. That was not done in the 2000 election. But the fighting the court's impositions of regulations over the behavior of supervisor of elections is a relatively new tactic. It really emerges out of the national 2020 problems, specific, for example, to Georgia, whose Secretary of State Raffensperger entered into consent decree, which altered the way canvassing boards had been verifying vote by mail ballots in Georgia. Ironically, what the Secretary of State in Georgia did was agree to a consent decree that essentially made them do the same thing that the state of Florida was doing. And that definitely is not good enough for both Governor DeSantis or Governor Kemp in Georgia, because now we're seeing all across the country the overarching thrust of all of this legislation, not only in Florida, Texas, Iowa, Arkansas, Mississippi, Alabama, and just about every state that's controlled by a Republican legislature, we're seeing an attack on elections administration and elections officials generally. This really was something that was pioneered by the Republican Party in the state of Wisconsin in 2015, when they abolished their Governmental Accountability Board, which was the board that they used to verify elections, elections dispute, and campaign financing disputes. And over the Scott Walker recount efforts in the state of Wisconsin, the Republican Party got very aggravated at a nonpartisan board that was investigating their behavior and their favorite candidates' behavior. And so in 2016, the Government Accountability Board was done away with, and a process guaranteeing more legislative control was implemented. We saw that also in Georgia, and we're seeing that now in Florida. Florida is a little bit unique in that we have constitutional officers who are elected, but that is still not preventing the Florida legislature from attempting to try to rigidly control the behavior of the supervisor of elections and limiting their discretion completely. We're seeing that with this provision, which requires that the supervisor of elections contact the attorney general, the president of the Senate, the speaker of the House, before they enter into any agreements with a court over any change of their process, which changes the Florida elections procedures in any way. So they're definitely not only attacking the discretion of the supervisor of elections, they're following a what I consider illegal or ill-considered process of trying to put the legislature more in control of the vote counting process in these states and taking away the discretion from the supervisor of elections. In addition to taking away this discretion and attempting to fight the courts, they also strip away the ability of any supervisor of elections to utilize any private monies to assist in the elections process. And of course, this is clearly aimed at Mark Zuckerberg's project, in which he provided grants to any jurisdictions in the country that needed additional monies in order to conduct their election. This was in direct response to the failure of the Republicans at the national level to appropriate the monies that were demanded by states. The state's elections officials had demanded hundreds of millions of dollars. There was legislation that would have provided that. But the Republicans in Congress objected to those funds being used. And essentially, they were attempting to starve elections administrators from conducting a fair election. And that failed through the use of these private grants, which in the state of Florida, 9 Republican supervisors accepted and used to enhance the process, buying supplies, disinfectants, PPP, additional voting equipment. A whole host of things were used that quite frankly made the election of 2020 in Florida a good election. So these monies are barred from being used by any supervisor of elections in the future. Um, I know of one county, for example, that spent the last of these funds 48 hours ago, anticipating, for example, that the law went into effect. And by the way, the law went into effect immediately. So there's no way that the supervisor of elections can plan for this. In St. Lucie County, for example, there are national change of address forms which have been ready to go on a postcard and were going to be sent out next week. Every one of those thousands of postcards will have to be destroyed and reprinted. And this is occurring all across the state in every supervisor's of elections office. If you had in your inventory pre-printed vote by mail envelopes, all of those will have to be destroyed and reprinted at no cost to the state, at additional cost to every county. Because while Florida does have a provision of not allowing funds to be charged to unallocated funds to be charged to the counties, that there's an exemption in elections for unfunded mandates. So the legislature can require and impose all kinds of requirements on county supervisor of elections that they have to fund. And I can tell you that much of the language in here is going to be a lot of workarounds, and there's going to be a lot of problems from the supervisor of elections. But again, no outside monies now may be accepted to help a supervisor of elections or a county prepare for an election. Let's get into directly into what I consider one of the only positive things in this bill, and that is that the legislature did require that the Secretary of State provide a comprehensive risk assessment for the online voter registration portal that the state of Florida provides to its citizens. And we all remember that in 2016 and 2018, there were failures in the online portal. This legislation requires that the Division of Elections conduct actual load tests with full load, testing the server's capability, and screening computers and networks used to support the online voter registration system for malware on a regular basis. These tests have to be conducted every 6 months. So that's a positive. That's one of only 3 positives that I've identified in this bill. Jumping from there into something that is a big negative, let's talk about the impact of this issue on third-party voter registration organizations, which is what the League of Women Voters is. This is some of the most, sadly, I will say, egregious types of changes that I've seen in this bill. This bill requires that the League of Women Voters tell the voters while soliciting voter registration applications that you're going to fail, that you could potentially fail, that you may not turn these in on time, and that in fact, you need to tell the individual how to access doing all of this registration on the online voting system portal and how to do that. That's what this law says. You have to essentially destroy your own credibility to citizens that you're seeking to get voter registration from. It imposes a series of fines that are really, when you read the entire bill, are not that onerous because they put a $1,000 aggregate total. But that's not the purpose of the bill. The purpose of the bill is to make collecting voter registrations by groups like yourselves more difficult, to intimidate individuals more thoroughly, try to convince them not to do this. And again, the mere fact that you must tell an individual that you may not be able to get their voter registration in on time up front is an affront to the organization itself. You must destroy your credibility to the voter while you're soliciting the voter registration application. And that's pretty clear. That's really not a very fair thing to do. But this bill is not about fairness. This is about intimidating individuals in the process that want to try to register voters. For example, a third party registrant, the organization itself, if they don't turn in a voter registration application that's been in their possession for 2 weeks, they're going to be fined $50 per application for not doing that. 15 days out, there's going to be fines. In addition to that, those fines jump significantly from $50, and you'll have to pardon me, I left my reading glasses at home, but for $100 per application, for every application that's delivered to the Supervisor of Elections office of the proper voters county or the Secretary of State's office, if those ballots are delivered after book closing. Interestingly enough, the worst fine, or $1,000, is reserved for third-party voter registration groups that forward a voter registration application to the wrong county. If you do not send the application to the Secretary of State's office or the proper Supervisor of Elections, you send it to a neighboring county by mistake, that fine is $500 for each application. Again, I'm not aware that this has caused a problem to the degree that an election official has received them in the wrong jurisdiction. In the past, they've just forwarded to the proper jurisdiction. So making this a finable offense is just another way to use a stick to beat on third-party voter registration groups, in my opinion. Again, the aggregate fine to any organization in an election cycle is $1,000. So these fines can't spin out of control uncontrollably. But again, it's putting these rules on a process that, quite frankly, didn't need them to begin with. And I'm unaware of any significant problems that have occurred around the state, for example, in 2020 with this. But again, I can point to almost every item in this bill and make that statement. There were no problems with, for example, drop-off boxes for mail voting. The only problem was that it was used too wisely by Democrats and African Americans. That's the only problem that I believe that this bill was designed to deal with. And that's the wrong way to approach this whole process, in my opinion. But again, as someone who has been subjected to these kinds of voter suppression legislative tactics by the legislature, it has not ended since 2000. Actually, 1998 is when I first saw the first voter registration suppression legislation introduced. Coincidentally, 1998 was the first year that the Republicans in the state of Florida were able to capture the entire Florida legislature, House and Senate. So from 1998 until this current moment, election supervisors, third-party groups like the League of Women Voters, and the voters themselves have been subjected to legislation which is designed not to make the voter registration process work or our elections more secure. In fact, nothing in this legislation, as I read it, makes Florida elections more secure. And the item, for example, that Governor DeSantis touted yesterday in his Fox only news exclusive media event was that Supervisor of Elections will not be allowed to mail unsolicited vote by mail ballots to voters in the state. That did not happen anywhere in the state in 2020. It is barred by state law. So to actually tout something that was already illegal really bespeaks to the fact that the governor was addressing a national controversy, a national issue, which he himself inflamed when he endorsed the big lie. And the big lie, in my opinion, is a poison that, if not dealt with, will destroy our republic. The big lie destroys the ability of citizens to believe that elections are accurate in this country. And I will tell you, my own analysis of looking at the 2020 election was the 2020 election was the best run large election in my lifetime. And I believe it was the best run, best administered election in probably in a century. And for the reward that the election officials and the citizens get for turning out the way they did and for conducting an election under the most extreme conditions, and I'm talking about the coronavirus here, their reward, getting smacked in the face, additional restrictions, and it's all because the big lie allows a cover for the Republicans to act. They generated their own distrust among their own voters, and their main reason for passing the legislation, as they directly said, was to reduce people's fears and concerns that the elections were problematic. Well, those are the exact same fears and concerns that the Republican legislature and Governor DeSantis engendered. So, in some ways, this reminds me of that classic case of chutzpah, where an individual has murdered his parents and throws himself at the court's mercy, saying, "I'm an orphan." This is the same type of thing. The big lie engendered the problem, and solving the big lie's problem, this will not work. The big lie's problem can only be rejected by the individuals who initiated it. Republicans need to recognize that in Florida, in Georgia, for example, 5 separate audits were conducted. 2 were done by hand, and these were statewide audits. And quite frankly, it shows that the totals were accurate. Yet I'm seeing reports by Republicans nationally making completely fallacious statements about the accuracy of Georgia's election. And they cannot produce one scintilla of proof to back these up, which is why they lost 61 court cases in the fall over the validity and accuracy of the elections. That's right. In 61 court cases, the Republicans charging fraud in the 2020 election were summarily kicked out of court because they had no evidence, because none exists. Going through the bill from the third party area, let's go directly to what it requires for voters. In the past, a voter could request a vote by mail ballot by simply picking up a telephone and telling the individual's name and birth date and confirming the delivery of the address for the vote by mail ballot. No more. In fact, there's a major push to try to get rid of all written documentation and put everything on voter registration applications. The voter registration application, for example, used to allow you to do name and political party updates and address changes without having to fully redo the entire online vote by mail application. That is not possible anymore. When a voter picks up a phone to request that vote by mail, in addition to their name and birth date, they're going to have to produce their Florida driver's license number to be matched against the actual data. And I will tell you, for example, that when I registered to vote, I didn't use my Florida driver's license number, so I have nothing to match it to. This is a big problem all across the state. Older registrants didn't have to put the Florida driver's license when they registered to vote. You could just simply use the last 4 digits of your social security number. Now they're going to want matching data, and there are going to be fields in many people's computer fields at voter registration records that are not complete. Um, Again, so you're talking about making the process much more difficult. A mere writing to the supervisor of elections is going to be disfavored. Almost, they're going to try to push everything on voter registration applications on the online portal. The same way that the League of Women Voters, when they're going to be registering voters, is going to have to tell the person that we may not be able to do this successfully. And there's an online portal. Here's how to get to it, and here's how to use it. That's what they want you to do. They don't want you to do it anymore. They want all of this traffic directed to the portal. So again, making the requests of vote by mail more difficult for no apparent reason. There is no reason to require this information. So if you don't have a Florida driver's license, they're going to require that you provide your Florida ID. Many individuals may have a Florida ID in lieu of a driver's license. One can go to the driver's license agency and get a Florida ID. It doesn't give the ability to drive a car, but it is state validated ID. And so that's essentially the direction that they want to push citizens to do. What they've done to the supervisor of elections is require them to set up a live time election portal and transmit that data to the Secretary of State so that they can track how all elections are going in every county in every election. The most onerous of these provisions was removed during negotiation. The initial legislation said that every 15 minutes, the supervisors had to update this. There's never been this requirement for updating current data, which is being flown into the office. And essentially, this is something that's never been done. We don't know how much it'll cost. It means that the main vendor for all the supervisor of elections is going to have to change all of their systems with regard to voter registration, vote by mail ballot, vote tabulation. All of this is going to have to be redone. I know that the main vendor has already turned off some features in the supervisor of elections voter registration databases in order to begin the process of changing it. Again, this is kind of a target that's never been there before. We don't know how it'll work out. Those counties that are large are going to have particular problems, but the majority of the problems will be the smaller jurisdictions that don't have technical staff. The legislature's completely ignored the fact that counties like Liberty County or that Franklin County might have 3 people that work in the office. They don't have a technical staff. They don't have a very large computer staff, if they have one at all. They're pretty much dependent upon county resources to do this. So again, there's this whole technical part that's been overlay to the elections process that is going to have to be ferreted out as we go through it. Something of a political nature that is also in this bill is the fact that, and there's an example of this happening right now in Broward County, it's converted what had been formerly elections, special elections to fill vacancies, have been removed from Florida law. It used to be that elections were favored, appointments to seats were not favored. And whenever a potential vacancy occurred, there'd be a special election to fill that seat. Well, let me give you an example. In the seat of formerly Alcee Hastings, who has passed away, there are a couple of Democratic Broward County commissioners who are thinking of running. If they resign those seats and run for that office, those empty county commission seats will no longer be put before the citizens for a special election. The law now requires that the governor gets to fill those appointments. Um, he is the sole arbiter of filling elected positions by appointees until the term has been fulfilled. So again, this is something that I personally oppose. I believe that we need to have citizens elect elective officers, not provide the governor with more authority to do this. But again, as we know through the COVID-19 process, the legislature, in fact, surrendered much of its oversight to the governor. So we now have a governor who is stronger than ever before in the history of the state of Florida. And we're going to have to live with that. In addition to making this elective process appointive, what the law also does is provide additional opportunities for partisan observers to become involved in the validation process of vote by mail ballots. This process is problematic because the legislature has barred individuals at all times from making copies of citizens' signatures. So no observers at any time can take notes or photograph or make any records of the vote by mail affidavits because the signature of the citizens is on that. How is this additional oversight of having observers either standing over the shoulder or watching videos, which I don't recommend, of the signature verification process, a process that usually, up to this point, had always taken place in secure areas of Supervisor of Elections office. It's going to have to be made public. So and again, for what reason? The reason is to gum up the process. We're going to have more objections for spurious reasons to vote by mail ballots that individuals have submitted. And again, the individuals who are doing the objections don't have access to the real signatures. So how can one make an objection to a vote by mail ballot? It's a mind-boggling process to provide partisan observers the access. And again, this is because of the 2020 false claims in Michigan, in Georgia, in Pennsylvania, in other states that were saying Trump observers were kept out from watching the process. I've checked with the voting officials in each one of these states, and every one of the jurisdictions, Arizona, Pennsylvania, Michigan, in which partisans made the claim that they weren't being allowed to watch the process, they were false. The Republican Party had gone through the process set out in statutory form to identify watchers. There were watchers at every one of the sites that were vote tabulating centers for these vote by mail ballots in Pennsylvania and Michigan. But what had happened was individuals who didn't know the law tried to storm in Maricopa County and in Detroit, Michigan. They tried to put new people that had no idea what the process was and have them come in as election observers after the deadline to sign up and do training for these individuals had occurred. So again, because of these false claims of the big lie, we have provisions now in our election code, which are very unwise, which at this point, the Supervisor of Elections don't know how they're going to accommodate this additional process of observing ballots. They certainly can't be admitted to the secure area where previously the work had been done. And again, every county is going to have to work out how they're going to do this. And again, in many jurisdictions, unlike Leon County, for example, which we had a consolidated facility built 4 years ago, most election officials don't have a lot of room. And they're going to be doing ballot duplication, for example, in 20, 30, or in major urban cities, there might be 40 duplication teams. Does that mean that there has to be 40 observers? Or can 40 screens be put up somewhere? And again, any of these individuals who are watching these screens or observing, they can't make notes, they can't take photography. It's a nightmare for Supervisor of Elections. I'm glad that I am no longer a Supervisor of Elections in the state of Florida, because having to do unnecessary work just to do unnecessary work for the big lie and costing a lot of disruption in the work and potentially slowing down the work is really not what Florida elections should be about.
Supervisor Sancho, thank you for that. We have so many questions that I'm going to have to, I don't mean to interrupt you, but we have a lot of questions that I want to pose to you.
All right.
Okay, so let me get started. I'm going to try to go in the order in which we have received these. From Corinne, does the new limitation on delivering no more than 2 completed ballots from non-family members apply to simply bringing ballots to the post office? I don't think that's quite accurate. I thought it was 1 immediate family member's ballot plus 2.
You can bring immediate family members. I don't think there's a limit on that, but there's 2 outside of your immediate family. And again, you have just pointed out a huge contradiction, which is essentially there's restrictions on me giving my ballot to my neighbor to take to the Supervisor of Elections office or a vote by mail drop box. There's no restriction on that individual taking it to the post office or a post office mailbox. Again, and if you think about this, what this is designed to do is force voters not to use the vote by mail drop boxes, which quite frankly was the most convenient feature coming out of the 2020 general election, were the use of vote by mail drop boxes. And this was a huge controversy in other states, not so much in Florida, because Florida created the vote by mail drop box at every early voting site rule before the ex-president created the big lie. So they were attempting to ensure that their own Republican constituents could drop off their vote by mail ballots in a simple fashion. After the Democrats, for the first time in the history of the state of Florida, used those vote by mail ballots at 1.5 million voters more than the Republicans, all of a sudden, now there's a problem and we need to restrict access to the vote by mail ballots, particularly knocking out all of the drive-through vote by mail procedures that were used in many of the South Florida counties. This particularly harms the large urban jurisdictions, i.e., read minority voters. So again, this is targeted for effect, but again, you're not restricted in how you send the ballot to the post office. You're only restricted if you're delivering it to an election official.
Exactly. Thank you for that. Now we have a question from Madeline. Has a newspaper or magazine done an investigation into the quote coincidence that all of the hundreds of voter suppression bills in the state legislators across the country are basically the same? And I believe, Supervisor Sancho, that there's been quite a bit of press about that this is the flurry of legislation in some 40 plus states, correct?
That is correct. 40, at my last count, some 43 states, over 250 individual bills of voter suppression. And yes, there have been articles which pointed out, for example, that the American Enterprise Institute authored a best practices set of procedures, which many of these items come directly out of. And when you dig further down, you find that these so-called American Enterprise best practices go to ALEC, a Koch brothers funded organization that essentially has been the boilerplate and manufacturer of a whole host of corporate and Republican legislation designed to not impact on those individuals specifically. So from ALEC to the American Enterprise to Florida, Georgia, Arkansas, Utah, you name it, Tennessee, wherever there's a Republican dominated legislature, these kinds of not best practices are being applied. And I'll say not best practices because, as an election official who's been called to testify on best practices, there were organizations out there that did offer best practices. And most of the supervisor of elections in the state followed those. And that was providing more access to vote by mail ballot, more early voting opportunities. The best practices by elections officials was designed to make sure that citizens could vote. The best practices designed by the American Enterprise Institute does just the opposite, is designed to limit citizen access to the franchise.
Okay, thank you. From Mary Ellen, since the legislation was effective immediately, does that mean we cannot have people fill out the vote by mail request forms we currently have from the SOEs?
That is correct. Again, I know that because the national change of address forms that are being used in St. Lucie County just had a checkbox for if you wanted to request one for the next election. They all have to be trashed because they don't have the place for the driver's license number or the 4-digit social security number, or the Florida ID number. All the forms now that the supervisor of elections send to solicit this information have to have those additional check marks on. So that means just about every form in every supervisor of elections office is going to have to be trashed.
Mm. You know, Ion, our Supervisor Sancho, we're getting some really concerned questions. And of course, I'm feeling very concerned about the impact on our organization. And we have a stellar reputation when it comes to voter registration and many other things. And now this law is going to require us to say these things to potential voters that may put doubt, throw doubt on our organization, throw doubt on whether their ballot or your vote's going to be counted. So, how do you best? What is your advice to us as how to best mitigate this?
Well, I think there's a great argument that you can't be required to trash your organization's um, uh, ability to do this before a voter. If you do not have a record of delivering voter forms late, why should you be required to say that? You're being asked to state a falsehood directly to the voter. But again, this is design disincentive to have the voter do this process with your organization. And I think this is legally challengeable myself. And so that's why I've agreed to participate in any litigation relative to this legislation. Because again, where is any requirement that you have to denigrate yourselves in order to solicit voter registrations? That's
Thank you.
that's crazy. It's crazy.
It is. It is. Thank you. And to Diane, yes, we will be developing some information that we can hand out. Um, so let's see. And yes, I saw a comment that the league is nonpartisan. We are nonpartisan, right? We don't take positions on candidates or party, but facts are facts. It's a fact that the GOP is pushing this legislation throughout the country. And we cannot ignore the fact we're not being partisan, we are being informative. So,
Well, and to that end, I have no party affiliation. I've been registered as no party affiliated for most of my professional career because, in fact, supervisor of elections aren't partisan. We serve all the citizens and not just the major parties, the minor parties, the Greens, the Libertarians, the American Constitutional Party. And in fact, the supervisors that I know over my career overwhelmingly wanted and worked to ensure that their legal voters can vote. But But as you stated, the facts of the matter is that on November the 3rd, someone told a major lie that I had, for example, had pointed out in July was going to occur based upon late arriving vote by mail ballots, because the Midwestern states of Pennsylvania and Michigan and Wisconsin didn't count their vote by mail ballots until after the election was over. They've been doing that for decades. And all of those legal votes that had been counted in every state for decades were now called illegal votes, votes that suddenly appeared. Well, excuse me, that's a complete lie. And vote by mail ballots in the state of Florida have never had a record of illegality. And voters don't vote and steal elections. The kinds of routine problems and fraud that does occur is at such a minute amount that when you actually look at the data, it's shocking. You are more likely to be hit by a bolt of lightning exiting a polling location than you are to find citizens casting illegal votes in other people's names in Florida elections. That's what the data shows, not only in Florida, but nationally. So to really call into question the most basic part of how the citizens select their governance by elections is a travesty, in my opinion, and must be dealt with directly.
Absolutely. From Annie Betancourt, our longtime league member, former state board member, and former legislator. As I get older, the drop box was very convenient to vote. I cannot stand for long periods of time. Removing the drop boxes, well, they're going to be restricted. They're not going to be removed altogether. They're just going to be restricted and available only at early voting hours. They're not going to be as available as they were before. But yes, that will it will increase the lines at polling places. And you're right, Annie, this will make it more inconvenient to senior citizens. Which Supervisor Sancho really makes no sense, since Florida is filled with retired citizens.
Well, there was an excellent article by Amy Gardner in the Washington Post a few days ago in which she points out that the potential of this actually hurting Republican senior citizen voters is there. In fact, this has not been well thought out at all, because, in fact, up until 2020, far more Republican voters had voted by mail than Republican voters. And again, all this is a knee-jerk reaction to the fact that you had the ex-president attack vote by mail ballots needlessly, except he praised Florida's, by the way. Florida did it right. Well, if we did it right, why are we subjected to all these changes? And again, that's because in this state, the big lie really is a cover not for the ex-president, but for the 2022 governor's race. Politics being what it is, any advantage that one party can gain over another, the other party reacts with a knee-jerk reaction. And both parties have done this. I'm an equal opportunity disabuser when it comes to the parties. I've had in my career a Democrat office holder browbeat me for trying to register young voters in the 90s because supposedly those are going to be Reagan voters. We don't care, ladies and gentlemen, who you're voting for. We care about your access to this most democratic franchise, the right to vote. And the results, that's up to the citizens. Except all across the country, we're seeing these Republican legislators trying to put their finger on the scale to change the outcome. And that's not right.
Agreed. And the league doesn't care who you're voting for. We want to register you if you are ready to vote as a U.S. citizen. It's your choice whether you vote for a third-party candidate, a Democrat, or a Republican. So we are with you on that, Supervisor Sancho. let's see, from Rachel, aren't the last four digits of the social security number still an alternative to a Florida identification card?
Yes. Well, it's not an alternative. You can't use it for ID purposes, but for the purposes of registering to vote, yes. But I will tell you, as an experienced supervisor of elections, there are lots of problems, both in the Department of Highway Safety and Motor Vehicles and with the Social Security Office, with social security numbers, because oftentimes, many decades ago, and this will impact older voters, many older women were not listed independently with their own social security numbers. And again, many of them didn't drive. My mother, for example, never learned to drive. So she really didn't have access to this data uh, readily available in her hand. And so now any I think it's going to have an impact on older voters particularly.
There's been a number of comments saying, well, if there's a voter there to register in person, why not just have them register online? You can do it right there with the phone. Well, I mean, I understand that alternative. However, if you have a voter there ready to vote, I mean, ready to register with that paper registration form, sending them to an online platform may not be the best idea. They may not want to do it right there on their phone or may not have a phone uh, with them. They may say, oh, well, that's a good idea. I'll just do it when I get home. We have lost a potential voter. They could leave. Who knows what will happen in the future, and they might not register. So that's a challenge for us.
Well, what I think you're going to see, again, I think what drove this huge vote by mail turnout was not some great love of vote by mail. It was driven by the fact that we were in the midst and still are in the midst of a pandemic. I developed an autoimmune disease last year. I could not go to an early voting site, which is my favorite way to vote, at all. I did not want to be and could not be exposed to other citizens. So again, the unintended consequences of this is that voters may simply show up at the early voting sites and use that, which is a perfectly acceptable alternative. And all these additional requirements will not be serve as a block to in-person early voting. And for example, in 2008, a majority of African American voters in the entire uh, presidential election that year voted in person early before the November election. And of course, that led to an attack by Governor Scott and the Republican legislature on early voting sites. And for the 2010 election, they were barred from voting on Sunday, leading in those huge lines. So, again, this is a historical effort by one party to eliminate the process that the other parties voters used to cast ballots. That's all it is. And it could be frustrated by the fact that they didn't restrict any more early voting sites. So it may be that in 2022, Democratic voters flood early voting sites. And in 2024, the Florida legislature will try to restrict those as well.
And let me just once again reassure our members on this call, the office, will be putting out guidance to you, talking points to you on this new law. And remember, we have filed a lawsuit on this, so we are hopeful that this law will be made null and void, as it should be. It is unconstitutional and violates the First and 14th Amendments. So here's another question. From June. Who wrote this bill? A legislator, committee staff, lawyer? Seems like it requires a mindset that is devious, malevolent, and requires great forethought. This goes to show that politics is a great game and not everyone is playing by the rules. Might makes power, she says.
Well, this is Might makes power. I agree. And unfortunately, unchecked power leads to corruptness. I believe in the system that really John Locke talked about, that our founders incorporated, and that's into our system. And that is, without a series of checks and balances, you don't have a democratic republic. And those checks and balances, unfortunately for Florida citizens, have been removed from much of the previous structures which were put into place by the 1968 new Constitution. For example, home rule is under attack everywhere. The centralization of power, which is ironic for a party that calls itself one focused on individual liberty, is actually believing in the centralization of power here in Tallahassee. And the actual author of the Senate bill was Senator Baxley from Ocala, who has a track record. And essentially, he didn't write the bill. It's clear in the discussions on the floor, he knew very little about the bill. And for example, I can tell you when House Bill 13 was 55, the bill I had mentioned previously, which limited early voting, that bill was actually written by the general counsel of the Republican Party and delivered directly to the leadership of and bypassed Kurt Browning, who was the Secretary of State. I know because on the day 1355 was announced to the public, I was meeting with Secretary of Kurt Browning, and I asked him directly, had you ever seen this? And he said, this legislation was never even provided to us. We never saw it. So in fact, the normal process of hearings, bill analysis, that's not being followed and hasn't been followed. This bill comes from leadership. It could have been written by the general counsel of the Republican Party, as the one in 2010 was.
Thank you. Let's see. What is, Beth asked, is there going to be a change in this law regarding returning citizens?
Well, the only change they did was add an additional box on the voter registration application saying that if you had been a felon, your rights have been restored. Uh, that's the only that's the only thing in this bill that applies to the returning felons. Otherwise, the 11th Circuit decision 6-4, allowing the state of Florida to impose this poll tax on its citizens, is alive and well.
Yes, it is. Several questions on HR 1. How will this affect if that federal bill were to pass? How would this affect this Florida law?
It would strike several pieces of this legislation and throw it out the window. Again, HR 1 clearly would have an impact on this. And quite frankly, I believe even the John Lewis Voting Rights Act of 2021, which I'm a tremendous supporter, even I support HR 1. But I also think if we're going to push anything first, it needs to be, we need the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act to reverse the Holder decision that the Supreme Court did to gut the voting rights in 2013.
Okay. Supervisor Sancho, we're right at 2:00. We're out of time. And I got to tell you, based on the comments and questions that we're receiving, our members would love to have you back because you have a wealth of knowledge on this. And going forward, we're going to need to tap into your knowledge more. So we hope that you will come back soon to give us another presentation.
Thank you very much. And I'm at your disposal. The
Thank
League has
you.
been one of the real stalwarts in protecting citizens and voters' rights in the state of Florida.
Thank you. And we intend to keep right on doing that. We know there are challenges, everyone. We're going to get out guidance to all of you. This is going to involve a massive education of our league members as well as members of the public. But we are also confident that our standing in this lawsuit is solid and that we have a good chance of prevailing in court. So with that being said, I want to wish you all a very happy weekend. Again, Supervisor Sancho, thank you so much for this incredibly helpful presentation today. And we'll see you next time, everybody. Take care and stay safe. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.